want to take a little bit of time today as well, and we'll jump into Matthew's gospel. Matthew is one of Jesus' 12 closest students, and he wrote a pretty large volume of kind of his experience with Jesus. And we've been working through this for several months now, and we're toward the end of Matthew's story and his account of life of Jesus. And I want to just catch you up to speed if you haven't been with us the last few weeks, and if you have, this will be just a little bit of review. But we've been talking about a pretty challenging chapter in Matthew's gospel. They've been having a conversation about different seasons and different signs. And in particular, Jesus' students, they've asked a couple different questions of him. They were sitting on the Mountain of Olives after Jesus had some conversations. And in these conversations, he described 3 different time periods. He described a time period where his representatives and his followers would be killed and mistreated and chased out of their homes and away from their towns because they had an allegiance to Jesus. He talked about a time as well when Jerusalem and its leaders would finally be ready to celebrate him as their coming king. And then he talked about a third time when the temple structure in Jerusalem would be destroyed, would be ripped apart stone by stone. And this caused a lot of questions to ignite in Jesus' students' minds. Namely, when is this going to happen? And what's a sign that we should look forward to? How are we going to know when these different events that you've talked about, Jesus, are about to occur? Because we're curious. And so Jesus is in the middle of answering that. And in his answer, it's a little bit cryptic because it doesn't really hit the nail on the head with the time. I mean, we would think, Jesus, we want a month, a day, and a year. And he doesn't actually respond that way. He gives them these cycles and these different seasons of what to expect until those times. And so that's what we're stepping into this morning. We'll do a little bit of review of that, like I said. But that's what we're getting into. Jesus answering his followers' questions by saying, instead of looking for a specific calendar date, there's going to be some different cycles of things that happen. I mean, natural disasters and people exalting themselves in positions of power and nations attacking other nations, things that we've seen during the time of Jesus that we still see happening in our world today. These cycles are going to continue happening. But then Jesus does kind of narrow it in because they say, what's the sign? Like Jewish people at this point in time, they were looking for some sort of sign, some sort of indicating factor that something was about to happen. And they said, well, when you're about ready to come back, and when the temple's about ready to be ripped apart stone by stone, and when this season of your followers getting chased around the world and, persecuted for your sake, when those seasons are over, what's going to happen? How are we going to know about that? And so Jesus gave them some signs. I'd like to involve you all in some of this as well and get your input. And so as we think about the issue of signs are things to kind of look forward to. What would be a sign that the weather is about to change? How can you tell the weather's changing? Maybe you live here and maybe you live somewhere else, and so the signs are different. Yeah.
Wind shift.
The wind shifts, okay? Yeah. Maybe it changes direction. It starts blowing out of the east or something, or a different speed. Yeah.
Smell of rain.
Smell of rain. Yeah, there's a creosote bush in southwest Utah, and every time it starts to rain, that moisture in the air hits the bush, and there's a very, very distinct smell. It smells like rain here. If you haven't experienced that before, stick around. The air smells very unique when it starts to rain. Something else. What?
My back aches.
Your back aches. I shouldn't be laughing at that, should I? That's very serious, right? But it's true. It's like we feel it in our bones. And some people I know who have had surgeries or they have pins in different bones, when it gets cold, you literally can tell, oh, something's happening. There's a storm on the way because I hurt. Yeah, sure. What about this? You're on the verge of getting sick. How do you know?
Your body aches.
Okay, body aches for you. Tired. Oh, yeah. Where did this exhaustion come from? I got a good night's sleep last night. Oh, I just feel so drained. You lose your appetite. That's an interesting one. Yes? You start coughing. Yeah. Sure. Anything else on that? Yes? Sore throat. Sure. One more. How do you know you're getting sick? What? Sneezing. Yeah. All these things, you're like, man, my health is headed downhill for a few days after this point. So in the same way, last week we talked about one sign. Jesus said, when you see this thing happening, you know things are starting to head downhill, right, toward these different events that you've asked me about. And last week, he focused on this sign, and one of the signs Jesus talked about, he used this weird term that ties back to Daniel, a prophet in the Old Testament. The term in the English Bible, and some of them, is abomination of desolation, which sounds kind of abstract. A better way to think of it, and probably more like when you get into the reasoning of that symbolism in Daniel, it's basically a cruel nation or allegiance of nations, and then this leader that's driving it all. So Jesus says, if you see some cruel leader and nation, specifically with its sights set on Jerusalem and the temple area there, then yeah, you need to be aware. Like, that's the sign that, these events are on the way. The crazy thing is Jesus didn't specify. He didn't say whether, if you see some enemy army and its leader approaching Jerusalem, with ill intent, he didn't say whether that means like that's the sign that the temple's about to be ripped apart, or that's the sign that his followers are about to not be persecuted any longer, or that's the sign that he's coming back. Like, he didn't specify which event he was talking about. He just said, if you see this. So it leaves it open. Maybe Jesus was talking about one of those three, or two of those three, or all three of those. And so, again, he's staying pretty ambiguous. He's not putting any dates on the calendar for us. And he went on in the conversation, that's what we're going to continue on today, to talk about 6 other. He kind of gave him some bonus signs. Just like we talked about the weather or sickness, it's not just one thing that indicates that, this thing is on the way. There might be multiple symptoms. And so Jesus is going to say, here's a few more symptoms and things to look forward to that are going to clue you in that, some of these things that you asked about, they might be happening. And the trick here, too, is that, maybe some of us, depending on our religious traditions, we're thinking in terms of like something ultimate. And I think the Bible ultimately leads us toward that. Like, there is this day coming, according to Scripture, it seems, where God is trying to restore things back to the way they were in the first couple chapters of the Bible, in the Garden of Eden, where he walked and talked with humanity, and they existed together as one, and co-ruled this world, and beautiful things were happening. And the harm and pain that we experience today was not really part of reality yet in the same way. And so he's tracking towards some ultimate restoration and some hope that we all have to look forward to. But there's also more cycles. And maybe some of the things Jesus is talking about as far as signs are just more cycles of the same kinds of cycles and seasons we talked about, where there's warfare and there's pain and there's famine and there's, natural disaster and all this too. So it's really tricky to nail something down directly. But Jesus does say these signs are going to indicate that, the things that you asked about are on the way. And maybe sometime we'll be on that final loop through those cycles, and Jesus will show up again. And I think that's what he leads us toward at the end of our discussion today as well. But he says, okay, one sign to be on the watch for is if there's this enemy army surrounding Jerusalem and its temple, some of those bad things we talked about, are about to happen, or maybe my return is about to happen, which would be a good thing. Second thing he gave them, the second symptom, I termed this covert messiahs and prophets. Again, these are 2 Bible terms that are kind of weird if you don't come from like maybe Christian world or upbringing. But we've talked about that word Messiah a little bit. What is a Messiah? It's a Messiah. I mean, that's kind of a word that's in our culture too. Like, somebody has a Messiah complex or is a Messiah figure. What do you think of when you hear that word? Go. Chosen one. Okay, yeah. Like Baby Yoda, right? I don't know. Or Anakin or Luke, right? I don't know. But, I mean, they were chosen ones, right? And Messiah kind of has that ring, like this person has been set apart for something special, right? What else do you think of?
The anointed one.
Anointed one. And that's more literal to its meaning, actually, in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, which is largely written in first century Greek. The anointed one is what it truly meant in context. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. What else do you think of when you hear the word Messiah? A leader. Okay, sure. Had a lot of associations with kings in the Bible and in that culture too. They were anointed people. Oftentimes kings in different cultures, they'd pour some oil on them at that point in time as part of the coronation process or like the beginning of their reign. Yeah. So that's kind of the idea floating around behind the term Messiah. You mentioned anointed one. And the idea behind oil in the Bible has really interesting significance. There's a lot of different nuances to it, but it kind of, on the one hand, the oils that were used in the Bible, some of them had fragrances added to them. And some of the same fragrances were the same fragrances that are mentioned early on in the Garden of Eden. So it kind of has this connotation of like a beautiful place where heaven and earth meet. And this anointed figure is supposed to kind of bring about, a little taste of heaven here on earth. It also has an association with bringing life And so kings were anointed, for example, in the Old Testament of the Bible. And they were anointed, and that meant like they were supposed to bring life, like oil would bring life. And oil brings light because in this culture it's used to burn lamps, right? They didn't have electricity in those days. And so if you want light, you've got to fill a lamp with oil and light a wick and do it that way. And so all these things, the kings and the leaders, they were supposed to bring light and a nice fragrance to society and life and a place where heaven and earth meet when you bring in the Bible context. And so this ultimate Messiah figure is actually supposed to really do that. Because if you read the story in the Old Testament, most of the kings, they fail, right? Because they're humans like we are. We don't bring about heaven on earth most days. We don't bring life to people some days. You know, it's not a good fragrance coming from us some days. We're not improving life for everybody some days. But this ultimate Messiah figure was the one who would kind of bring all this to fruition and bring it about. Also, we're going to hear Jesus talk about prophets. What are prophets? What do you think of when you hear the word prophet? What is a prophet? Yeah.
They describe future events.
Okay. June says, I think of somebody who tells the future, describes future events. Sure. That's what we think of. What else do you think of when you hear the word prophet? Yeah.
They would speak for God.
Okay, a spokesperson for God. Somebody else said something back here. A messenger. Yeah, that's good as well. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Yes. A voice what? A voice of reason. That's good. Yeah, definitely. All those are kind of ideas that we have floating around. We hear about prophets. And the word, the Old Testament word was navi, and that is a word that means to bubble up. And the idea is that somebody's spirit would just start pouring out stuff from God, you know, in a spiritual context. They would just start bubbling up, like there was something causing their spirit to just start erupting, you know, and saying something on behalf of God. That's the idea behind it, behind prophets. And Jesus talks about messiahs and prophets, plural, in the next thing he says in verse 23 of Matthew 24, verse 23. Jesus says, if anybody tells you at that time, and this is tied in with the time when you see some like nation or leader approaching Jerusalem, you know, with ill intent. If anybody tells you when these kinds of things are swirling around in the air, see, here's the Messiah. Over there, there's a Messiah. Don't believe it. He says, for false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even God's chosen ones. And so the idea is that there's going to be leaders, people who say, I'm here to bring a taste of heaven on earth. People who say, you know, I'm giving life to people. There's going to be prophets, people who say, I'm speaking on behalf of God. The things that are bubbling out of me, this is what God wants you to hear. And he says, be careful about that, because there are going to be people who they say that, but they're really not representing what God wants to share. And they're really not going to bring you a way that, that brings life. And they're really not, you know, trying to create a place where heaven and earth, you get a taste of heaven on earth. That's not really their intent. So be careful about that. And they'll have things to convince you that they really are authentic. And the words that are used are kind of ambiguous as well. It could refer to everything from some sort of miraculous sign. And we do see different rulers, even in the Bible or history, like we think about Pharaoh in Egypt. And he's got some priests on his behalf that are seemingly doing these supernatural tricks or magic tricks or whatever to convince people that, you know, he's supernaturally empowered. Maybe it's that, but another word that's used that Jesus describes, the wonders thing, that just means something strange that gets your attention. And think about the things people do in this world that catch your eye and catch your attention. I mean, it could be anything from America's Got Talent to just, wow, this person is extremely rich and wealthy, and look at the opulence and the luxury, and they just, like, success just oozes out of them, you know. Or they've got, you know, a limousine and a whole entourage that surrounds them every time they travel anywhere. It could be any of these things, but they're just people who are standing out, who are leaders or who are religious representatives, but they're really not representing God. Jesus says, take note, I told you about this in advance. So if they tell you, see, he's in the wilderness, the Messiah or the prophet figure, don't go out. Or see, he's in the storerooms. These are like the small rooms in the Jewish houses at this point in time where you'd store your grain. And, you know, we think of like a cellar today or something like that, you know, that people maybe a decade ago or a century ago, or I guess more like a century ago would use, or in some regions of the world still use today to store their goods, like a small room. He says, if you hear that, don't believe it. And the idea behind that is these are figures who are kind of operating a little bit in secrecy. They're kind of covert. And that's in contrast to the way that Jesus tends to operate. Sometimes these figures that are misrepresenting God, they're going to tend to operate in secrecy. Like, you've got to come out and see me. You've got to join my group. You've got to do my thing if you want to experience me. And Jesus says it's not going to be like that when I come back. In verse 27, he says, just like the lightning, this word's confusing too because it means bright shining. It says lightning comes from the east, so it could mean lightning flashing across the sky and lighting up everything. Like, think of lightning at night, how it just lights up everything for a flash. But it could also be talking about the sunrise, when the sun peaks up over the east horizon in the morning and that light just shines on everything, and it's so bright, and you hate driving into it, right? If you're on a road trip and it's about 7:30 in the morning and you're driving east, you've got to face that bright, brilliant light. He says that's what it's going to be like when the Son of Man comes. And that's a term that there's a lot behind that, but Jesus uses it to refer to himself in a lot of ways, in the third person kind of. And so he's saying, when I show up, you're going to know it. I'm not hiding from anybody. We'll press pause on that because he's going to talk about his arrival in a few more verses as well. So basically what we can pull from this, anointed kings are religious leaders who claim to rule or speak on God's behalf. They won't really be doing that. And they're going to offer some strange and supernatural and, maybe even attention-getting proofs that they really are legitimate. And maybe we've seen people like that in the world. Did you know there's actually, I think, 50 people in the last 200 years that are well-known historical figures who have claimed to be a Messiah from different walks of life, different religions, all around the world over the last 200 years. And then if you look at history and the way that kings and national rulers have behaved, so many people try to behave like they're God on earth, right? Or representatives of God on earth. They have absolute power, divine power. All these things have been loops throughout history. And Jesus says, be careful about that. You'll know when it's me. The third sign he says, and this is kind of descriptive. He says, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. I mean, that's a real appealing visual, isn't it? Like, a lot of translations say carcass, but the word's actually corpse. And so it's talking about human corpses, talking about battlefields, I think, here. Talking about casualties, because whenever you see vultures gathering, because there's just so many corpses around, people haven't had time to deal with the mass casualties and the battle situations or the pestilence or the disease, right? So you're dealing with overwhelming casualties. And Jesus seems to be describing, a situation like this. This will also come at a time. And again, are we talking about some huge event that will befall the earth in the future? Maybe. Are we talking about things that have already happened throughout history? Probably. Are there any things like this that have already happened in the experience surrounding Jerusalem, surrounding some of the things Jesus, questions Jesus was answering at this point in time to his followers? I think one of the things that we definitely saw happen in history was when the temple was destroyed. Because if you look back historically, about 40 years after Jesus was having this conversation with his followers, there was an army that came in. The Roman army came in, and they surrounded and besieged Jerusalem. It took about 2.5 years. The Jewish people rose up against Rome and revolted. And so finally, a general named Titus came in, and they besieged the city, and they ripped apart the temple ground, the temple complex, stone by stone, and threw it down. That's why if you travel to Israel today, there's just kind of like a western wall, right? There's a wall up, and then there's a flat area on top where now there's the Dome of the Rock and some other religious sites, Islamic religious sites. But there used to be a Jewish temple structure there, and it's not anymore because Rome ripped it apart. And when they did that, we think about these lines about, casualties, things of that nature happening. A contemporary historian, first century Jewish historian named Josephus, this is what he wrote. He said 1.1 million people, most of them Jewish, were killed during that siege. Can you imagine a devastation like that in one city? And that was primarily, according to Josephus, because it was when Passover was occurring. And so there were hundreds of thousands of people making pilgrimages into Jerusalem to celebrate Passover right when Rome besieged Jerusalem. So people were trapped in the city. he says that the Romans killed the armed people and the elderly people and enslaved 97,000 people as a result of it. And 40,000 individuals survived that the emperor let go where they chose because their city was decimated. If you want Romans' historical perspective on that, because again, Josephus was a Jewish historian, Roman historian Tacitus said the total number of besieged were 600,000 people in the city. And so whether you look at 1.1 million or over 500,000 people, there's a lot of casualty that resulted from that. This wasn't the end of it. About 50 years later, there was an uprising called the Kitos War. In the Kitos War, Jews in different provinces around the Roman Empire, Alexandria, Egypt, the area that's now Libya in northern Africa, some of the islands like Cyprus, the Jews revolted and killed a lot of Roman citizens in those cities. And so ultimately that set up something called the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 to 136 AD or Common Era. And in that, what's interesting is we were talking about these Messiah figures. There was a rabbi named Rabbi Akiva, who was a very well-respected Jewish rabbi in the 2nd century. And he said that this man, Simon Bar Kokhba, was actually the Messiah. And he quoted Old Testament scriptures to tell the Jewish people that this was the Messiah who was come to earth. And he actually led a revolt against the Romans to set Jerusalem free. And for about 2.5 years was able to completely free Jerusalem from Rome's rule. This is what the Jews thought their Messiah, their deliverer, would do. In one battle, they fought against the 7th Roman Legion, and they took out 6,000 Roman soldiers from that legion. And then at that point, the Roman emperor became very concerned. And so he took a third of the entire Roman army and sent them to Jerusalem. And I bet you can imagine how that would turn out. 985 of the most famous villages in Israel were completely razed to the ground, obliterated. 580,000 people were slain in Israel as a result of those battles. It says, and this is Cassius Dio, a Roman historian, he says nearly the whole of Judea, the whole province, was made desolate as a result of this. There's also a quote in a Jewish piece of literature called the Talmud. It says the Romans went on killing until their horses were submerged in blood up to their nostrils. Again, that's probably a little bit, hyperbolic, right? Probably didn't actually do that. But where have you heard language like that before? Book of Revelation talks about blood rising to the height of a horse's bridle. And so it was a figurative way of saying there was a lot of death that happened that surrounded these things. And so you can look back in the past and say, well, maybe in a sense, some of these things happened that Jesus was talking about. Certainly about the Jerusalem temple being destroyed. But then maybe there's more of this same loop that's going to keep on happening and even center around Jerusalem in the future. Not only that, and we're almost through this morning, in verse 29, Jesus, he starts quoting Old Testament stuff and he gets a little more poetic. He says, immediately after the distress of those days, when you see all these different signs and things happening that you've been asking me about, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light and the stars will fall from the sky. You think, man, that sounds intense. I don't remember seeing anything like that happen before. I mean, how many of you have ever seen, I guess you can see falling stars, right? But those are meteorites. How many of you have literally seen stars start moving across the sky? Those are pretty stable, right? How many of you have seen the sun get dark? Maybe some of you, right? Think about eclipses and things of that nature, right? Maybe. And then at night, right? It drops below the horizon. So maybe. The moon will not shed its light. That's interesting. We have new moons and things. And so one way to look at this is maybe Jesus is looking ahead into the future and he's being very, very literal with these statements. And we should literally expect things like this. Another possibility is that Jesus is being very, very poetic, like the entire Old Testament has been, by saying these phrases that have been used repetitively to talk about specific things in the Old Testament. Have you ever heard about darkness in the Bible before? You think of any times in the Bible where darkness happens? Yeah. Okay, Revelation, which is apocalyptic literature, yeah. Anywhere else, darkness. Yes? When Jesus died on the cross, okay? Darkness. 10 plagues of Egypt, right? The 9th was this eerie, thick darkness that came over the land. Anybody else? Darkness. Genesis. Yeah, the first place, right? Genesis. Because what was there in the beginning, right? Darkness. Yeah, and God separated the darkness from light, right? He made light. That's the very first thing, right, that happens is God divides that and puts a light out there. Maybe himself, but he separates darkness. So darkness is a theme we've seen over and over again throughout the Bible. And it seems like whenever we have darkness, there's some element of chaos in God's, I put the word cosmos here just because it sounds cool, chaos in the cosmos. Cosmos just means the ordered world. It's where we get the term cosmetics from. So if you use cosmetics, it means that you're ordering yourself in your appearance. And the cosmos means the ordered universe, basically as we know it. And it seems like when you have darkness, you have chaos, and there's some links there. Here's some places in the Old Testament where the similar language is used. One, Amos in chapter 8, he's talking about Jerusalem's downfall. When Babylon comes in and ransacks Jerusalem about 600 years before the time of Jesus. Only Amos is writing 200 years before Babylon ever comes in and ransacks Jerusalem. This is what he says about that time. In that day, this is God's declaration, I will make the sun go down at noon. I will darken the land in the daytime. I will turn your feasts into mourning and your songs into weeping. I will make that grief like mourning for an only son that you've lost. So he describes a time when Jerusalem is besieged and attacked by Babylon as a time when the sun gets darkened at noon. Did that actually happen in history? I mean, who knows? As far as I'm aware, we don't have a record of it. But it's poetic language used to describe a very dark time, right? In Jeremiah 4, he writes about Jerusalem's downfall just about 40 years before it happens, and this is what he says. The skies above will grow dark. I have spoken. I have planned it. I won't relent. It's interesting. In Isaiah 13, Isaiah writes about Babylon and how Babylon one day will be conquered by the Medes and the Persians, by that next empire that comes after it. And this is what he says. He says, look, the day of the Lord is coming against Babylon, cruel with fury and anger, to make the earth a desolation. Indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shine. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked people for their sins. I will make the heavens shake, and the earth will shake from its foundations, because I'm stirring the Medes up against them. And Babylon, the jewel of the kingdoms of the world, will become like Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's Hebrew poetry, and it's saying bad times ahead for Babylon. It's going to be like the stars got shook, and it's going to be like the sun went out. You're going to experience a terrible time. In Ezekiel, this is talking about Pharaoh and Egypt, not Pharaoh and Egypt back in the Exodus, but later on, Pharaoh and Egypt are going to basically have another round of consequences. And this is how Ezekiel describes that time against Egypt. God says, I will darken all the shining lights in the heavens over you. I'll bring darkness on your land. This is a declaration of the Lord God. And maybe it's a little nod back to that time when earlier Pharaoh, in the time of the Exodus, experienced darkness on the land. But it's saying you're going to go through another cycle of the same kind of destruction, the same kind of desolation. And so when we look at statements like this, there's a couple options. One is we can read them very literally, and perhaps we'll come to find that that's the way they're intended to be read. And another way to look at them is that we can read them very poetically, because that's the way they've been used a lot of times in the Bible in the past to describe this time of desolation and destruction and darkness. A darkness that really might be summarized as confusion and violence and destruction and spiritual darkness that people who have been oppressing other people eventually face. So maybe that's a good way to look at this as well. And then Jesus makes another statement. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. And that leaves another interesting thing for us to think about. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. This is at the end of verse 29 in Matthew 24. Powers of the heavens. You could look at that as like the stars and the heavens and those kinds of things, the same kind of language as the poetry we just talked about. But there's also scriptures like in 1 Peter in the New Testament where Peter calls heavenly beings the powers of heaven. And so maybe Jesus is even commenting that this realm of heavenly beings might be disturbed or shaken or agitated in some way. It's going to be so intense that there's going to be ramifications not just in the human world on earth, but in some heavenly realm as well. And again, that opens up a lot of conversations and not a lot of answers. But maybe there's some possibilities of this is more than just the physical created world here that's being affected by these circumstances. And then the final things we'll look at, Jesus says in verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear. It actually is the word shine. It's coming back to that lightning and that sun coming up imagery we just talked about a few verses ago. The sign of the Son of Man will appear. So that's another sign. And Jesus uses that term, Son of Man, again, to refer to himself. He says, and then the peoples of the earth will mourn. We'll talk about that phrase in just a second. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So again, it's this, if you want to know the ultimate thing that you're looking for, when all these things will finally come to a completion, it's going to be me that you're looking for. And you're going to see me. It's going to be clear to all of you that I'm coming. And he says in that phrase, all the peoples of the earth will mourn. And I think that's kind of strange to me, because it would seem like to me that some people would be excited, right, about Jesus' arrival, especially if it's going to bring some ultimate type of restoration, right? Like, I would tend to be excited. I wouldn't necessarily be mourning that. And then it seems like other people might, be in a state of actually mourning that, right? Because it's going to show them that something that's totally out of their paradigm, is now they have to acknowledge this and deal with it. And so I can see kind of both sides of it. But what's really interesting here, and this is kind of just food for thought, the word mourn, it's the word chop in the New Testament. So if you were to read it literally, it's all the peoples of the earth will chop, right? Sounds funny. But chop was used two ways in the New Testament. One, it was used of people would beat their chests when they would mourn at this point in time in history. Maybe some people are grieving so much that they'll grab their clothing or their chest today, because the mourning and the grief is so severe. That was one use of it. The other use of the word chop appears when Jesus walks into Jerusalem and people are chopping down the palm branches. And so in that sense, people are chopping to celebrate Jesus coming. And those are the only two ways that it's used in the New Testament. It's either a chopping of branches to celebrate Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem, or it's people chopping against themselves to grieve and mourn because they're dealing with such intense pain. And so maybe we could look at that both ways. At some point in time, Jesus says, I'll show up, it'll be clear, and some people will be chopping in celebration so they can wave their palm branches, and other people will be chopping in grief because they're seeing me, It's interesting. It just creates a lot more conversations, I think, as a result of that. And then finally, Jesus says, he, the Son of Man, who again, I believe Jesus is talking about himself in the third person with that phrase because he uses it throughout the Gospels. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect, or his chosen ones is what that means, from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So four winds just means all over the earth, like people are going to be gathered, ends of the sky, like all around the earth. That was the phrase just to indicate that. But the word angels, again, we can look at this a couple different ways. Maybe these are heavenly spiritual beings that appear in the New Testament, and God's literally going to send out some angels from heaven to collect some chosen ones, some human followers of his to himself. Or maybe these messengers, the word angel means messenger, maybe they're not heavenly beings, maybe they're just his human messengers who go out with trumpets to declare, everybody gather, he's here. So it's interesting. It doesn't answer all of our questions. Maybe it creates even more ones. But these are the things that Jesus tells his followers to look forward to in regards to their questions. If you want to know what signs might be associated, looking down the road, with the temple in Jerusalem being destroyed, these are going to be some of them. If you want to know what signs to look forward to when the time of my servants being hurt, harmed, chased out of parts of the world is going to come to an end, these are some of the signs to be looking forward to. If you want to know when I'm going to come back and step foot where the temple was again, because Jesus said I won't come there again until people are ready to celebrate me, and they sure weren't when they killed him on the cross. He says, if you want to know when that time's going to be, here's some signs to look forward to. But if we genuinely look throughout history, we can see loops We can see times when this has already happened in the 1st and 2nd century, and maybe even with different empires, even toward Jerusalem since then, and certainly towards other places in the world today. So it's a cycle. It's ambiguous. It's not every time you see this, I'm going to show up. It's one of these days when you see this, I'm going to show up. But until then, there's going to be seasons, and maybe there's going to be cycles of these signs.